Sure. Ernie is a man who lives locally, and he started out as a physics major, became a physician, and specialized in drug development testing and in neurologic and psychiatric diseases. But in his bio, he tells us he developed skills in quantitative and biostatistics. He's got a climate simulator training effect to see how the effects on climate play out against different policy options. And he's associated with both local and national climate groups. The Morristown chapter of Citizens Climate, Chatham Borough Green Team, Summit Area Green Faith, and I think he's both an interesting and very well-informed speaker. Ernie?
Okay. All right, so I guess you need to share the screen, or ask for the screen, or?
You should be able to share it.
Right.
Okay.
Very good.
It's there.
There it is.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you for having me today to speak about climate change. I'm going to put a little bit of an emphasis on New Jersey in climate change. I thought that would be of interest. First, I want to make a distinction between climate change and global warming. Climate change is basically being driven primarily by global warming. So they're not identical, but they are interrelated. And it's the warming of the atmosphere and the land and the sea that brings about the climate change. And the climate change, you'll see examples of that later with heat waves, changes in precipitation, drought, sea level rise, so forth. So climate change, global warming. A couple of headlines you'll hear sort of throughout my talk is that we've known about global warming for quite a while, but we have not done a great deal. The evidence for climate change has become much more obvious, but even in the recent past. And we do have knowledge and tools of how to handle climate change, but it's going to be important to begin to take significant action before too long. This I borrowed from another presentation where they put down climate change, the essential truth in 5 points, 10 words. And I've organized the presentation in this manner. So the first is that it's real. And then the second is that it's us. It is human activity is the primary cause. Point out then that experts widely agree on that it's real and human-induced. Make some points about the projections, what the future may bring, and they can be serious and significant. That's the it's bad. And then there's hope that we can minimize some of this if we take significant steps. So it's real. I pulled this off the New Jersey State Climatologist's website. It's got some cool little data sets there. And I was able to plot the New Jersey average annual temperature since it's first been recorded, and records have been kept in 1895. The dots are the average temperature for that particular year, and you can see it certainly bounces around like weather tends to do. But then there's a line which does a little bit of smoothing to take into account some of the scatter. And you can see that there's definitely been an increase, and it's about a 4° Fahrenheit increase on this record, which translates into about a 2.2 degree centigrade change. A lot of the climate material is in centigrade, so it's helpful to kind of be able to bounce back and forth a little bit. So 4° Fahrenheit, 2.2 centigrade. This is another one that I pulled off the New Jersey site, and I thought this was interesting because it showed the 3 main regions that the New Jersey climate is categorized. Division 1 is our area in the northern area. Division 2 along the center, and Division 3 is the coast. And then you can see the temperature increase that I showed you from the prior slide. This is now broken down by season and by those 3 regions. And you can see that I've shaded them in blue for the ones that increased the most. And you can see for region 3, which is the coast, it's the one that has had the biggest increase overall. About the same for winter, but it has had largest increases for spring, summer, and fall. And you can see that in the column of winter is shaded. So of our 4 seasons, the one that has warmed the most is our winters. And I don't think that would surprise too many who've lived here their entire lives or most of their lives. This also is pulled from a New Jersey site. This is the sea level at Sandy Hook. And you can see all the measurements. This is every month measurement. And you can see from about 1930, it's been about a 15-inch increase. Now that's a little bit more than the sea level rise due to climate change, because Sandy Hook has been subsiding a little bit. So about maybe a third of that is subsidence. But it's been about a foot increase since 1930, which is pretty substantial. Now, this comes from the 2018 U.S. National Climate Assessment, where the U.S.
You're muted, Ernie.
Sorry, you're right. I just hopefully it just happened.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know, whatever. So this is from the 2018 National Climate Assessment from the National Academy of Sciences. And this is just a graph showing 12 areas that they've examined to see the effects of climate change in the United States. So it's A through L, so the 12 different changes. And I'm going to go through them very quickly, one by one. So starting with A, temperature, B, heat waves, and so forth. So this is the average temperature change in the United States over the last roughly century. And you can see this by the shading. In New Jersey, it's one of the areas that has warmed the most, and that's well known that New Jersey has been heating up more. And you can see that in general, there's been warming, particularly in the upper Midwest and out west, and there's been a little bit of cooling in the South. Alaska, of course, has been warming quite a bit. So that's temperature across the U.S. This is some example of measured heat waves. The trend since 1960 on its way up. This is heavy precipitation. Not quite as obvious, but it does appear that since 1990, there seems to be some evidence of increased heavy precipitation in the U.S., which would be predicted by global warming. And you can see the reduction in the snowpack, which I think has been in the news a lot. The ski resorts are having to deal with that. Drought conditions. This one does not really show any obvious trend to me, but is something that is predicted to become a significant feature in the future. This is the Arctic sea ice. And again, I think we're all aware that that is rapidly diminishing. And you can see this is the U.S. Portion of the Arctic sea ice. This is the U.S. sea level. I showed you New Jersey situation, and this is for the United States as a whole, increasing here from 1920 by about 8 inches. This climate change is affecting marine life as well. So you can see the number of species diminishing, and the distance that they have to relocate because of the temperature change is increasing. And the ocean CO2 that's is increasing in the atmosphere goes into the ocean and adds to making the ocean more acidic. So the number is going up. The pH goes, the pH goes down means it becomes more acidic. So that's what you're seeing here. Change in the growing season. You can see that there's a fair amount of green. So the growing season is extended in many parts of the country. and a few areas in the southeast where it has shortened. This is a double-edged sword. The increase in growing season, but the climate is changing. So the crops that have been cultivated in a certain area for many generations may no longer be suitable. So we may have a longer growing season, but you're going to have to grow something different. Wildfires, again in the news. And heating and cooling days. You can see the red that we're having more heating days that we have to deal with and fewer cooling days, which is the blue. So this is a look at the many areas in which the National Climate Assessment looked at in the United States, and to see the 12 different variables indicating that climate change is real and it's happening, and you might think by some of these figures that it's accelerating. It's us, so human activity. So this is something from published in 1912. So it's not new to much of the scientific community that this could happen. So this is an article called "The Remarkable Weather of 1911." And you can see, I don't know if you can read it, but at the bottom it says, the furnaces of the world are now burning it's 2 trillion tons of coal a year. And at the very last sentence, it says this effect of creating a temperature blanket over the Earth is going to maybe considerable over the next few centuries. And it's been 1 century since this was published, or a little over 1 century. This, I'm not going to go through this in any detail. It's just to show you the sort of an illustration of the heat trapping blanket that these greenhouse gases cause, and of which most change or most influence right now is carbon dioxide, which is about 75% of the human-induced warming. And what I've circled over on the right is the greenhouse gases. So what happens is, as you see on the left, the sun beats down on the Earth and warms it, and then that energy much of that energy is then released in that orange thing going upwards, slightly on the right, and that infrared radiation, warming radiation, is captured by the greenhouse gases. So instead of escaping back out into the solar system, it's captured there and then heats the atmosphere. And from there, the heating extends down to the Earth and so forth. So it's those greenhouse gases capturing infrared energy released from the Earth that stays there and increases this blanket. There is a normal greenhouse effect that the Earth has that does keep the temperature probably about 50 degrees warmer than it would be without the normal greenhouse. But by adding more greenhouse gases, that blanket is getting thicker and holding in more heat. So I'm going to focus mostly on CO2 because it is the biggest culprit. And this is an example of the emissions since 1880. You can see that back then, there was very little emissions except for what was projected to be due to land use change, which is a lot of deforestation. And then more recently, you can see the fossil fuels kicking in around 1920, and with coal, oil, and gas making up the large bulk of this. So releasing probably about 35 gigatons of CO2 per year. This is New Jersey. I took this from the 2020 report, and this shows the CO2 emissions, or actually greenhouse gas emissions from New Jersey, most of which is CO2 because we don't have a lot of methane or nitrous oxide. So mostly CO2. And I've circled the things on the left: the transportation sector, electricity generation, that of course does not include our nuclear, commercial and industrial, and residential. So those are where the fossil fuels are burned to release CO2 into the atmosphere. So I'm going to look at some of the time trends for CO2 concentration. This is from 1960 on. So the last
It's
60 years. So you can see that we're now reached a level of about 415 back in 1960 was about 310. You can see it's sort of a steady increase, maybe sloping up further at the end. Now it's taking the time back to about 1700. So we're talking about 400 years now. And this is not using measured atmospheric CO2, but there are ways that scientists can discern what the CO2 concentration was in various years. And you can see that it was about 275 at the beginning, and then very slowly increasing, and then with a rapid increase after 1950. And now we're winding the clock back 10,000 years. So this is roughly the time of human civilization. And as a species, we've been fortunate for our development to have a very stable, relatively stable climate for the last 10,000 years, and the CO2 was basically stable during that period of time. There is some small increase, but if you look at the right side, this is a very long time axis, so you can see the recent increase goes all the way up to the top of the screen there. So it just takes off. And I'll go back one step further. Now we're going back 800,000 years. Now we go back to a point where you can see the different ice ages. So when the CO2 tended to be low, those were the ice ages. So this, I think you can see my arrow, but that's the last ice age that we emerged from. And these are periods in between the ice ages. And you can see that over these 800,000 years, the highest CO2 concentration was 300. So it gives you an idea of what how 410 or 415 compares to what's happened for 800,000 years before. This is a graph which is double y-axis graph. So you see the sort of the purplish one, which is the atmospheric CO2 that's measured. So that it was a steady measure of around 275, as I said before humans were burning a lot of fossil fuels, and then increase. And then you can see the CO2 emissions that are from fossil fuel combustion increasing about 1850, so about the beginning of the very active phase of the Industrial Revolution, and increasing over time till 2020. The third of the fifth and sixth words that I mentioned, the experts agree. There's a scientific consensus. It's been published that about 97% of scientists agree that it's occurring, and humans' activity is the underlying cause. There is a video at Yale Climate Connections where they discuss this at length. These are some of the scientific organizations who have issued statements in support of the fact that climate is changing and it's human-induced due to release of greenhouse gases. So U.S. organizations and international organizations. Very recently, there's been announcements by several countries about their goals. China, within the last month, intends to become carbon neutral by 2060. Japan, again, within the last month, by the new prime minister, 2050. South Korea, 2050. EU, they've been on board for a bit longer, but also climate neutral by 2050. Canada. And even I noticed recently when I was Googling this that Putin has issued a request to decrease emissions by 30% by 2030. It's bad. The impacts are serious. So here's another New Jersey image, Atlantic City. These are tidal flood days. So these are the number of days in the year that the high tide reaches the stage of flooding. And you can see on the very bottom, this sort of this copper-toned bar chart. You can see that since 1920, it's gone up to close to about 25 days per year. And that's also shown on the curve above is just very small. And you can see the projections are over to the end of the century that there will be tidal flooding in Atlantic City pretty much every day of the year. This is from a New Jersey summary as well. This is the projected temperature increase. You can see now this is Fahrenheit, so you can see through 2020 this up and down line is the temperature average temperature in New Jersey, and you can see that then extending out to the end of the century, the temperature continues to go up. But it goes. They have two scenarios here. One is the higher emissions. That's if we don't do much about reducing our greenhouse gases, and you can see the temperature goes up in the range of 12 degrees Fahrenheit.
Putin have Parkinson's.
And then the lower curve is if we do take significant action as a world, on the Earth, to reduce emissions, that we might be able to manage to not increase by 12, but perhaps by 6 degrees, which is still will make a very significant change in our climate. This is a tool that I've been trained to use, which is a computer simulation of climate. And you can see in the upper right, they've got this chart of the temperature change. And what it's showing you is that with the assumptions that are currently in the model, and this matches most scientific estimates, that by the end of the century, the increase will be about 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And the hope would be that we could reduce emissions and therefore reduce the temperature increase to try to keep it in the range of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. And that would be a way to avoid some of the more significant damages that will occur if we do not temper the increase in greenhouse gases. So this tool I'm going to mention just a little bit about in a moment. So this is just an expanded version of what I was talking about. So this is the temperature increase, business as usual, 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And the goal will be to keep it under 2 degrees centigrade. So I mentioned that if we, business as usual, if we don't do much, 4 degrees centigrade, what can that mean? That can mean things like a multi-meter sea level rise within 50 to 150 years. Try to imagine what that would do to our coastal cities. A widespread increase in drought. It's predicted that the Mediterranean portion of Europe will become extremely dry and qualify for desert. That's the prediction. Frequent floods and heat waves across the world. The temperature increase is not readily reversible. The CO₂ has a long life in the atmosphere, thousands of years. So once it's there, it's unless we can remove it, it's going to continue to keep the temperature up for a very long time. Another thing I won't spend much time on, but it's something that's mentioned in the literature, is that there could be tipping points. We've sort of talk about this as gradual and progressive and continuing sort of in a steady way, but things could happen rather rapidly and make things substantially worse. Things like very abrupt melting of Antarctic ice sheets or the Arctic ice. Permafrost melting or thawing may release large amounts of methane, which is more warming than CO₂. You may have big irreversible effects on our coral reefs, rainforest, ocean temperatures. All these things could have reached tipping points and have fairly large changes over short periods of time. And that we won't anticipate them, and there'll be big changes that will occur. There's hope. Okay. So what are we dealing with in New Jersey as an example? So these are our greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And you can see I've circled that on the left, that the big ones, which are transportation, which is 42%. We drive a lot in New Jersey. Electricity generation, we burn a lot of natural gas to do that. Commercial and industrial activities, and we heat our homes, and we heat the water in our homes, and this causes substantial release of CO₂ as well. So this is the New Jersey sources of CO₂ from fossil fuels. Now, New Jersey is working on this. They've just issued a report called the 80 by 50 report, planning to reduce emissions by 80% by the year 2050. This is from that report showing where we are today in terms of emissions. It's over 100, I guess this is gigatons. And then the target would be by the year 2050 to reduce by 80%. So you can see where we have to make strides in reducing these emissions in transportation, which is the large bottom color. And then the next one is electricity generation, and then residential and commercial, usually heating. So these things need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions very substantially to meet this goal of 80% reduction by 2050. It's just another illustration from the same report that to get to this 80-50, we need to move to 100% clean energy. We need to move to 100% light duty vehicles being electric. This does not include the large commercial trucks, which hopefully many of them will be electric or some other form of fuel. And that 90% of buildings will be electrified, moving away from burning usually natural gas in our homes and our businesses. So this is another screen from the En-ROADS, which shows where policies might make changes. I say policies, I mean laws, regulations, and so forth. If they were to alter the energy supply by reducing coal or oil, that would reduce the release of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Increasing renewables would benefit that, as would nuclear. Another thing within the energy realm is a carbon price. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So these are places that policies can be made or laws can be passed to influence our use of fossil fuels. In the center, we have things like transportation. So if our transportation became more energy efficient and electrified, that would help. Our buildings also more efficient and electrified. And on the right side, an area I haven't spoken about much, but there is significant methane release that contributes to global warming. Deforestation as contributing. Afforestation, meaning growing new trees, is beneficial and as a form of carbon removal. And there are a lot of research now on trying to find economical ways to reduce carbon from the atmosphere. So there are important technological things that could occur, but they're not on hand yet. So here, one of my summaries, what's it gonna take? And it's gonna take a combination of many things: renewable energy, energy efficiency, changes in land use, changes in food supply. I didn't mention that here, but I should have. Carbon capture. And with luck, some important new technologies may come along relatively soon and can be implemented to help us out. One thing I did circle was the carbon price. So within the En-ROADS model, I was showing you that the single most effective lever is the carbon price. And it can be done where a fee is placed on the uses of carbon, and that fee is then returned to citizens as a dividend. So this is sometimes called a carbon fee and dividend arrangement. And there is, I think there's more than one draft act in Congress right now, but one is the Energy Innovation Act. and which is a carbon fee and dividend program. And Malinowski is one of the co-sponsors on that legislation. There are, I think, over 80 House members who have signed on for that. And also speaking towards a carbon price, I put in the bottom here something that was published in the Wall Street Journal about a year and a half ago about an economist's statement that this was using a carbon fee and dividend program that this 3,589 US economists and this other list of very distinguished economists have gone on record saying that this would be a very important and effective, timely, and economically sound way to begin the process of reducing the use of fossil fuels. Just as a quick example, the Energy Innovation Act would, in year one, place a $15 fee on the excuse me, a metric ton of CO2. And sorry. And that would add about 10 cents to a gallon of gasoline. But then the program, the act would then increase the fee slowly over time to give the economy to respond to that price increase and move away from the use of fossil fuels. So that's it. So that's my little spiel on climate change, what may happen, and some ideas about ways to try to diminish some of the more significant changes. So thank you.
Ernie, that was very, very interesting. You threw a lot at us in a half hour. Would you suggest that people start driving Teslas, for example?
Well, the question often comes up, what can I do? And yeah, that would be one thing that a person could do. But not enough of us are going to voluntarily buy Teslas to make a big difference. I mean, I own a plug-in hybrid. How much of a difference is that making? I don't know. Some, but what we really need is, as a society, to make changes. We need to do it together as a group if we're going to have big changes. Yes, Teslas help, heat pumps help, changing your diet helps. There's lots of things that can help, but voluntary activities not gonna make the difference.
Professor, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
No, you can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
I apologize for getting on late, but as a land use planner and as a Jersey guy who doesn't think in geologic terms, that in my lifespan of 75 years here in New Jersey, and I've seen dramatic changes, some good, some bad, in New Jersey, but you know, we are, I think everyone understands, the most densely populated state in the nation and in the most densely populated region of the country. And then I look at the chart on the Jersey side, that really interests me because I see 42% transportation. And I think of our economy as someone who's kind of thought about this a bit, that even in my lifetime, we've gone from an industrial economy in Jersey, kind of a smokestack economy, to a service economy. And then I look at 42% transportation, that's the biggie. And then having just moved from Hudson County, returned here to Summit, and I saw the enormous growth of the container ports in Newark, the mega Panamax 2 trips. So it's global transportation bringing massive numbers of containers filled with foreign produced goods. And then they all get on diesel trucks and on diesel trains after they're unloaded off the diesel boats. And I don't see anyone, including the governor's office, that's doing a fabulous job with this energy master plan, looking at the commercial side. They keep focusing on the light vehicles, and it's really those belching trucks you know, I can tell you, having just moved back to Summit, that the air quality in Summit is not appreciably better than it is in Hudson County. You know, the pollution and all these vehicles, these trucks that are delivering to our door, and just the lifestyle in the suburbs of sprawl with a lot more vehicles, more people driving out here. And then the lawn mowers and the leaf blowers that produce terrible pollution, really, and particulate matter. They're blowing only God knows what into the air when they're cleaning my driveway. So there are lots of things here at the local level, and I assume a lot of that is nitrous oxide also, and particulates as opposed to CO. So I look at the microclimate, and it looks a little different to me than the mega picture that you're talking about. Any response?
Well, I didn't go into it, but health is important. You mentioned that, and though we have done a good job as a country in cleaning up our air, it's still quite dirty, and there's a lot of chronic disease. I mean, you can't, you know, if you get ill with a lung condition, you can't pinpoint that on pollution, but it's known from looking at large numbers that much chronic illness is still due to air pollution in the United States. So that is significant, and there's good data to talk about that. And yes, transportation is big, and the trucks, I think, are going to be a tough nut to crack. I mean, are we going to have electric trucks? That's very challenging. Are we going to have hydrogen, clean hydrogen fueled trucks? I mean, these are things that we have to look at. It's important and hard work, and it's going to take some investment and some concentration, commitment.
Delivery services seem to be talking about converting their fleets of delivery trucks that are ubiquitous. So I think that if they're going back and forth to warehouses, you would think they could charge many of these delivery trucks.
Yes, certainly for local ones, right? I think of the 18-wheelers going cross country, but yeah, I mean, and that's one thing that a carbon tax will influence. It'll start to have an effect. I'm just saying this, I don't know this for a fact, but maybe they'll rediscover some transportation by trains, much more energy efficient. Once money comes into play, behavior changes.
Let me ask a question. Since I guess climate is no longer a 4-letter word, or perhaps it's no longer a 4-letter word. Is there a way to measure? Because of COVID, the reduction in transportation, is there a way to measure whether, in fact, the last 8 months has actually had a decline? Because that would be very persuasive data point if you could actually show that the level of reduction. And because I've often read that airplanes, one trip across the country, creates as much carbon as all the cars for that day or something like that. And certainly air transportation is way down. Is there any way to measure that? And is anybody trying to do that?
I think they demonstrated it very well at 9/11. When all the planes were grounded, they showed a significant drop in the pollution.
Yeah, and there has been a drop with the pandemic, though it's been seems to be short-lived. That it's rebounded quite a bit, so it hasn't stayed down, from my understanding. I haven't looked at it in great detail.
Ernie, can I just comment on the somebody mentioned landscaper equipment? It's sort of interesting. If you study landscaper equipment, you'll find out not only is there a noise problem, but there's a pollution problem greatly in excess of what you would think, because for automobiles and even for trucks, the country has been on a campaign for the last 20 years to try to clean them up in some way or another. But there's been no corresponding campaign for simple things like commercial leaf blowers and commercial lawn equipment. And so now, especially for communities like Summit, Madison, Chatham, the landscaper equipment is becoming more and more of an issue because A, it's noisy, B, it emits a lot of nitrous oxides and methane, which have not been cleaned up like they have been in cars. so that 30 minutes of operating a commercial leaf blower is like driving 100 miles with a car. And that's the statistic I saw somewhere. And that's an interesting challenge that communities like ours are wrestling with, because as you said, there are technical challenges, and putting enough batteries in a leaf blower for a commercial guy to use it for an afternoon is still a bit of an overwhelming thing. So it's a battery technology issue. But for communities, bedroom communities like ours, that's an interesting nut that we'll have to crack. And I read somewhere that 5% of the greenhouse gases in the country are due to landscaper equipment, which blew me away. But something for people to keep in mind.
Air travel was mentioned, and air travel does add a lot. I mean, I guess that doesn't surprise anyone. And there's actually a lot of emissions that in New Jersey are from the jet fuel and the use out of the airports, particularly Newark Airport.
Yeah, I can just tell you that I went to the Environmental Commission and Summit 2 to 3 years ago to talk about the problem with landscaping equipment, leaf blowers and the like, from a noise pollution point of view, as well as air quality. And they were very reluctant to discuss it. They were skeptical about it, and they thought that they would be sued by the landscaper industry, and they weren't willing to do it. And I appealed to them saying, the council can't deal with this. They look to the environmental community to give them advice. That's why we have boards. But maybe it's time to go back and talk to them again and see if they've given it any thought in the last 2.5 years.
I think there's more data now. I think there's real data you can show. You can't get sued for showing real data. And the noise is a matter of subjective. Actually, there's physical harm that occurs at some of these levels. And the other part of it is it's been identified as being harmful to the operators, most of whom, without going too much in depth, are people who don't want to complain about it, you know, but it is regarded as a health hazard for the operators. So the industry doesn't want to do anything about it.
It's a regulatory issue, really.
Yeah, and sometimes you can make them quieter if you make the emissions worse, or vice versa. So you have to look at that trade.
Yeah, I think I'm on the green team in South Orange. This is Susan Haig. They did pass an ordinance in Maplewood, and
Right.
yes, there was a lawsuit, but there was people I think are quite for it, the ban, and South Orange is doing the same. So they're finding a way around it. The problem was when they weren't fair, when they were only curtailing certain businesses. So it has to be a consistent ordinance, but agreed, that's a major thing. I have a question, Ernie, and thank you so much for these stats. Is there a conversation, a broader conversation about health and COVID? Because it seems that there would be quite a significant alignment between actions citizens by the million could take to be healthier in terms of COVID, not traveling, et cetera, and actions citizens by the million could take to speed up our transition to sustainability. But we're talking about defeating COVID and getting back to normal. And it seems to me there's a real opportunity to leverage both.
It's been discussed, and within the environmental and the climate change community, I've not stayed on top of that debate, but there's been talk about not wasting a good opportunity, that somehow these things can be coupled, that in ways of recovering from the pandemic, we can implement climate change practices that make sense.
Well, I think the other thing, as far as change, nobody ever could have foreseen the whole world changing their behaviors to the extent that they did once the COVID crisis erupted in March. And because of that, it gives you a new sense of what changes people can decide to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, it's shocking if you stop and think about what we've done, how we've changed, what we've had to do. It's hard to imagine we would have done that.
Yeah, if somebody had said that would happen, you'd say, no, there's no way.
Right.
And another thing that's encouraging to me is that Rotary International has now added environment and ecology to their areas of focus. And of course, they've been focused for decades on health, global health, really quite remarkable work. So there's also a possibility there to leverage Rotary, which is has huge potential influence around the world.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Ernie, you had,
I have a question, Jim Fleischman. Is there any discussion about nuclear? And I know it's been an extremely controversial issue, but liquid sodium plants were developed right after the Second World War and have been shown to be extremely safe, but because of the nuclear military program, they couldn't be used in submarines, so we went to water-cooled systems. Has there been any significant discussion about liquid sodium nuclear generators?
I don't know anything about liquid sodium. I know there's talk. I've been aware of talk about thorium, aware about new designs for conventional reactors, and fusion is also come back on the table with some recent papers. But maybe Peter, you want to add something. Peter's got his doctorate in physics, so he can speak more to that perhaps.
Now that you set me up, I can say that I too have not been following the details on the nuclear industry. I've been so wrapped up in electrification of things that I can't add any information.
Okay.
But I think, the adoption of EVs, in terms of things you can do locally, EVs and create pressure. They create examples for other people in other counties and other places. So I'm a little higher on what individual action can do. The plastic bag ban was an example. A couple of individual communities started it. A few more individual communities started it. And eventually the whole state started it. So there's a lot of things that happen because of momentum. And so I would just like to
just a follow-up to that. I read a report several years ago, I think it actually came out of the CIA, that they projected that if a fairly small 10% of the roof capacity in the United States had solar capacity on it, that would basically be able to replace the majority of the carbon burning electric utility plants. Is there any credibility to a statement like that?
Ernie, I mean,
I don't know. That's
Okay.
a little, yeah.
I won't say anything about 10%, but I've heard statements like that about a small percentage of available surface area being converted to solar electricity, taking the place of a lot of fossil fuel systems.
Okay.
It's also been found that it's a complicated problem because the sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. So in California, they've done some very interesting studies about the mix of wind, solar, battery, and even some natural gas backup that they would have to retain to reliably power their grid. And residential solar is in our neck of the woods is a very powerful contributor as well, which is underexploited right now.
Yeah, I have solar panels on my roof, and for the past 3 months, I have not paid a penny for my electricity.
Yeah. There are incentives in most towns. Most towns right now still make it very financially attractive, and the state is making EVs financially attractive.
Isn't it a reality that the utility companies have far more ability to do this? So we're getting a major investment in coastal New Jersey in wind power, and if PSE&G, as they are committing to do more, that has far more effect than what we can do as individuals. They have monopolies on the production.
Yeah. In terms of the overall problem, that's undoubtedly part of it. Yes.
Another question, Susan, again. A book came out a year ago called We Are the Weather. It was actually a very powerful book with a lot of statistics saying that the quickest way to change the quotient of greenhouse gases is to change our diets. And that would have the most impact when you add up all the stats of global agricultural practice, plus transportation of and growing of grain and feeding animals, everything else. So obviously meat is a factor. Can you, that's another big statistic, Ernie and Peter, can you talk to that?
It's hard to get a steady or a firm fix on that number, but it is big. It's definitely big, especially if you accept what they say in terms of not having cows belching or having cows existing, really, because of the grain that they eat, the land that they use, the trees that need to be cut down, transportation of food for the animals, transportation of the animal food. And but it does come up to be a fairly substantial number. I don't know if it's 25%, 30%, could be, but that's really stretching it to changing all those many aspects. So it's big, but it's I think some people look at that and say, sort of slip into that's all we really need to do is change our diets.
Oh,
and
no.
I wouldn't conclude that. Yeah.
Nobody says that, but I always am concerned when it's not said, because if it's that huge, that's something that could happen immediately.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good time to put in a plug in a roundabout answer to that question for David Attenborough's movie, A Life on Our Planet, I think was the right name, A Life on Our Planet. It's both beautiful, convincing, it holds your attention. I think it would hold the attention of children as well as adults. And he makes a case that we need to reforest a lot of the earth. And he says, how do we do that? And when he talks about changing our diet and eating more vegetables, you scratch your head and you say, well, how are we going to eat more vegetables if we decrease the farmland? And the point is that most of the farmland in the country is being devoted to animal feed. And so you change the diet, you change the balance of how the farmland is used, and you still are able to reduce the total amount of farmland, use it for a better diet, use it for less meat. And it's a very complicated, multifaceted, equation to study that. But in any case, the movie is wonderfully entertaining to watch.
And it's also hopeful, which is nice, because we usually have gloom and doom with this.
Yes, it's hopeful. Yes.
The forest fires out west, which have been unbelievable, raises the question, if you're talking about forests, that this interface between the forest and these wild areas where people seem to want to live in these very forested areas has created enormous problems. The pollution is we were getting pollution here in New Jersey from those fires.
Mm-hmm. The sunlight change, you could tell. Yeah.
So that's a land use decision that they're permitting people to develop residential areas where people arguably shouldn't be living.
Right.
But we also live on the Jersey shoreline, some of us, right? And you can talk about that too.
Right, yes, absolutely.
Same issue.
We did nothing after Sandy, but now people to rebuild.
Right. Yep.
Could I ask one more question? This is Nathan. What if you were the Biden administration, what would be the 3 initiatives you would do to, I think maybe more focused on systemic change? What would be the 3 changes or policy proposals that you would make?
Well, if you're probably not a surprise, I would impose or have a carbon fee and dividend program. That would be number 1. I think it makes the economic arguments makes sense to me, and we know money talks. So that would be 1. What would be next? I guess a push towards renewable energies. Not exactly what steps that would be, but more offshore wind, for example, is something that we could exploit.
I think if the country as a whole looked at what California has done with regard to emission standards, and just said there's a huge chunk of population, both rural and urban in California, that are living with a set of emission standards that are supposedly green. Now, I don't know if they're applicable to the rest of the country, or if they make sense for the rest of the country, but I think looking at that kind of a situation.
Well, but the standards, you mean driving towards use of renewable energy?
Yes.
Or,
yeah. And what they do is they accomplish what you said, which is push toward renewable energy. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's 2. So what's the third?
Got to be transportation, I would think.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I should have. That
But
should have been an easy one. Yeah.
What's the policy though? What do you want to see happen in transportation?
I would investigate whether short range travel would benefit environmentally by the resuscitation of the rail network compared to taking planes from Boston to New York to Washington. I don't know what the environmental trade-off is between the Acela and a shuttle flight, but I'd be interested in finding out.
Hard to imagine it's not substantial.
Right, the takeoff is
gravity defying is hard.
The takeoff is just so energy consuming for the airplanes. Yeah.
And also because work can be anywhere now, it just changes. It should change the equation of the need for speed. Speed was always, you don't want to waste all that dead time, but it doesn't have to be dead time anymore either. So it's interesting to think in terms of slower travel.
Right. Maybe we should just ask Elon Musk what he would do. Create those tubes underground that go 700 miles an hour.
What about retrofitting buildings as a solution, as a national program?
I think that's I don't know if it'd be top 3, but that's very important. We people aren't going to do it unless they're forced to do it, or the energy costs make them do it. But yeah, our buildings are not very energy efficient.
And people need to look at that on a regional basis. One town can't do it by themselves because they price themselves out of competition with the neighboring town. But when you look at a couple towns together, or when you look at a county or a state doing tougher building codes and that kind of stuff, it becomes a powerful thing. And the En-ROAD simulator that Ernie showed has an energy efficiency factor in it, which is energy efficiency in buildings. And it allows you to see all these different effects and what has to be done. And when people say, what are the top 3? You can go to the En-ROAD simulator, and anybody can play with the sliders in that simulator and get a feel for what we need to do. Bottom line is we need to do many things. No one of them works, but it's an excellent tool. If you want to send out the link for that, people can.
Yeah, it's freely available. You don't need to even
Google En-ROADs.
Right. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not necessarily going to be obvious how to use it, but you're allowed to. Sorry.
Gentlemen, you've given us quite a program, and I think we've kind of hit the end of our time together. So I want to thank everyone. I know our president had to cut out a little bit ago. I see the applause, which is great. Thank you very much for being with us. And you've given us a lot to think about, never mind act on. So